write a picture book.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a rule of thumb?
Yeah.
You were talking about, if a book said I for Indian or something like that.
Yes.
To me, that's oversimplification, right? Or generalization, I guess. But in this book, this is an example of a book that's written for very young children.
Right.
That is still very culturally rich.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like a traditional picture book, ABC book. It is, one letter and one drawing per page, one word per page, just like you would expect. But in this particular book, some of the words are in English and some of the words are Navajo words.
Oh.
And so what's kind of nice is K is K-ya. And I'm sure I do not speak Navajo, so the pronunciation might be slightly off. But what's nice, and this means land, and it's got a really nice picture of a southwestern landscape. But what's really nice about this book is it also has a glossary in the back. So it'll define the words, and it'll give you a pronunciation key. So as a teacher or a librarian, you'd be able to practice and do a proper pronunciation. And then some of the words are in English, like dress or earrings, but then it would portray culturally appropriate examples of that letter.
I want to just quick chime in on this. What's interesting when I saw this book that Joyce pulled, the author, Lucy Tapahanso, she's actually an established poet. She's written a couple of children's books. There's one, Shiprock Fair, that I'm familiar with, where it's her recollections of visiting the Shiprock Fair as a child. And I think on the cover of the book, it's kind of like a mini little Ferris wheel. But what's interesting with this is that this is not uncommon for a lot of Native writers, poets in particular, but also novelists. After a while of publishing successfully, they decide that they want to also start writing children's books. And the one person that I've done a lot of research on, I mentioned earlier, Louise Erdrich, the interesting little story here. She said when she was growing up, she loved Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie books. She read them constantly. After she had a couple of children of her own and she started reading these books aloud to them, she kind of started feeling more and more that maybe these books weren't necessarily depicting her tribal group accurately. She's Chippewa or Ojibwe or Anishinaabe with all kinds of variant spellings. But basically she's from the Minnesota, North Dakota, Canada area. Some of her relatives are in Canada and some are in the U.S. She decided actually after reading, she had a couple daughters, and so she did the same thing. She read these books to them, each daughter, and by the time she had read them to her, I think her third daughter, she really felt like she was not as favorably inclined to the Little House on the Prairie books because of the way that Native Americans were depicted, especially Native Americans that were supposedly representing the Great Lakes area where her group is from. And so what she did, she actually started her own series of children's books. This is where her book series, The Birch Bark House, came from. She's published 3 books in that set, and from what I have read in interviews with her, she's planning on having 10 total books in this series.
Wow.
She doesn't do anything small scale. But that was really interesting for me to kind of read about this, where, these books had some, formative aspect of her growing up. It was one of the series that really got her interested in reading. And she thought enough about them that she and her husband both would read these aloud to their children. But then after a while, and these books were historic, they were several decades old by the time she was reading them to her kids, she realized that, I don't want to kind of perpetuate these sort of stereotypes, especially when my children are Native. I don't want them to kind of, incorporate those sort of negative feelings. Internalizing those, exactly. So that's one of the reasons why she started writing the young adult novels. She'd published a couple of children's books, but, they did not touch on important issues. I mean, they were interesting, I like them, but they were, total of 250 words. This book series that she started was directly in response to her feeling that, there need to be more Native authored books out there giving children, good Native children, good understanding of where they came from, who they are, and that they contributed to the American history overall, and that they weren't just conquered, vanquished, and dying out people, because that unfortunately has made its way into children's books as well.
So Okay, here's an ethical dilemma for a librarian. You mentioned the Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which are probably in every single library, both school and public, and are available for kids to read. And so, in terms of what you do with those types of books that maybe looking back are not the best, most accurate representations of, have those characters that are portrayed very accurately, what do you do as a librarian? Do you get rid of all the stuff that's got
Offensive?
That's offensive, or how do you handle that?
I would say absolutely not. I mean,
Okay.
Laura Ingalls Wilder is an important American author. Her books are historically significant. I think you absolutely keep them. If your library loses them through theft or something, buy new ones, buy new editions of them. But it would probably be a good idea if you are teaching a course on multicultural literature or Native American literature to point out some of the limitations of the author at that time. Maybe find information about what Laura Ingalls Wilder, what her interactions were or were not with Native Americans. She lived in that general area, but did she have any interactions with the people that lived there previous to the settlers coming? So absolutely keep the books in the collection. They're historically significant. Even if they're controversial, like The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter is another book. That's one of the few children's books you will find in any Barnes & Noble or Borders books. Joy Harjo has a children's book. Louise Erdrich has children's books. Leslie Silko has some young adult things. You don't find those sometimes at Barnes & Noble and things like that, but you will always find The Education of Little Tree. And for those who don't know, that book won several awards, and then it came out that the author had kind of faked his credentials a little bit.
Yeah.
He was actually a former Ku Klux Klansman and a speechwriter for George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who was very pro-segregation. And so that has colored the reception of this book to a degree, but it is still very available on shelves, and there is no disclaimer about it. So my concern is that people know the whole story. I'm not saying pull the book from the shelf at all, but I do think that now if you see a book, a new book that's published, and you don't know a lot about it, or you see some of these negative, stereotypical, generalized sort of depictions, fortunately there are other options out there, and if the quality of a new book doesn't prove itself to you, go and look elsewhere and find something, because that's the one thing, at least now we have a lot of options. I've read some of the Little House on the Prairie books. They're interesting. So I totally think they're appropriate in libraries. I think The Education of Little Tree is appropriate in libraries. But it's always good to not just see this one won an award, this one. Look to see if there's any sort of thing that comes out after the fact. Because the things with that Education of Little Tree, that didn't come out until about 15 years after the book was published, that this guy was a former Klansman. One of his relatives, who was a professor, actually kind of outed him. But there are some books like that I wonder if the booksellers know. And honestly, to be critical here, I'm sure they don't care. If the book sells, it sells.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that, Joyce?
Well, I mean, I've heard it argued both ways. So I've actually heard certain American Indian reviewers say that a book is so harmful to American Indian children that it simply shouldn't be in a library. That you can say that you can discuss a particular issue, discuss the fact that this might be stereotypical, but if it's internalized and it's psychologically damaging, then it simply should not be there. So just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit with what Joe had said, and I think some of it has to do with the age of the audience, too. That, younger children are not really going to be able to understand, they're going to read one thing and they're not going to be able to analyze it in a critical way. They're looking for things that pertain to them. So they're looking at children and they're saying, how is this child like me? How is this child not like me? That type of thing, wanting to learn those similarities and differences and looking at basic emotions and stuff like that. So they're not really going to be at that level where you can have a harmful young children's book and then have a discussion and explain why, here's another book that offers a different alternative and, can you explain the stereotype?